It's a great pleasure to speak to an audience in Oxford University, and particularly the subject which is today being discussed. It's a very troublesome subject. This morning I spoke about the great benefit of the English legal system, how it's been transplanted into India, and how today we subsist and exist because of that system. But there is an aspect which is really troubling most of us today, and that is the aspect of undermining of the Westminster form of parliamentary government in India. It's a matter to be seriously considered whether we are not really sitting on a time bomb. We still pride ourselves in India being a democracy, the largest democracy in India. Around us, in the neighboring countries, democracy has failed. India still boasts of democracy. We feel a sense of pride in that. But at the same time, there is a feeling whether this is not merely just planted in India, and the contents of a democratic structure has really gone down to the roots. And this is particularly because the system of parliamentary government today is increasingly seen as being alienated from the masses. We have no doubt legislative assemblies in 22 states in India. Each of them have got a cabinet form of government. Each of them are elected after 5 years. Each of them carry on government. And in that sense, in a technical sense, they are responsible to the people of those states. Equally, we have the parliamentary system in India at the center. After 5 years, there's an election, and we have a new government. And today, does the parliamentary system really reach out to the people, is the question to be considered. Now, we have today a phenomenon which is increasingly developing. It's called the politics of protests. And that protest takes place in an extra parliamentary way, not only in Parliament but outside Parliament. And that is today more considered to be voicing the people's voice rather than the representatives in the legislative assemblies or in Parliament. 60 years after the Constitution has come into force, parliamentary democracy in that sense appears to be losing its original purpose and direction. It's the vast size of India which prevents any authoritarian government or a revolution in India. In the first flush of the working of the Indian Constitution in 1950, from 1950 I would say to 1975, with leaders of the eminence of Pandit Nehru, Parliament functioned in India as it functioned in the United Kingdom and in the Commonwealth countries like Australia and Canada. You would see the legislative debates of those times were excellent, and there was a responsible government and a responsible opposition. There were legislation debates were of the highest order, and proceedings were conducted with extreme decorum. Sir Ivor Jennings, the famous author on politics, said that in our cabinet form of government, we must have in practice government by consent and the opposition by agreement. Now that is the formula by which a cabinet form of government works. Today conditions in India are very different. There are total chaos and chaotic scenes in parliament, in legislatures of the other states, disruptions, demonstrations with placards in the well of the house, and holding up proceedings for days together. Parliamentary assemblies are not permitted to function. Simultaneously, you have ugly demonstrations outside Parliament, what in India we call bunds, that means closures, and public life is brought to a closure. These sort of protests and demonstrations weaken the whole parliamentary system of government. It's a matter of concern whether this would, if it perpetuates like this, are we not undermining the whole parliamentary system? As it is, as many people feel today, this is superficially planted. When you consider the vast country which India is, does the parliamentary system reach out to the villages? Do people know what happens in parliament? Do people know what happens in the legislative assemblies? How is this daily life affected? It's all very well for a small country like UK, where the House of Commons represents small constituencies. There's a daily contact between the Member of Parliament and his constituency. There's very little like that in India. Are we therefore really speaking of a representative democracy in India? It's a very serious consideration. That's why some time back the constitution was amended to say that we should have what is called the Panchayati Raj. That means at the village level you have a certain amount of representation which will voice the level of the voice of the people. That hasn't worked very successfully. But what is today, unfortunately, happening is even that superficial form of parliamentary government which we have in India is breaking down. Let me tell you of recent examples of the famous institution of the Indian Parliament, the premier institution under our constitution. In 2010, Parliament was forced to adjourn from day to day for 23 sittings from November 9 to December 13 on the opposition demanding a joint parliamentary committee in what is known as the 2G scam. We have periodical scams in India. The word scam has become endemic in India. So there was a 2G scam. The minister for the electronics and telecom was indicted, and it became a matter of great concern because corruption is the verb today, is the order of the day today. So the lower house, which we call Lok Sabha, worked only for 5.5% of its available time, while the upper house Rajya Sabha functioned for 2.5% of its available time. Only 4 bills were passed, and that too without any debate. Supplementary demands and appropriation bills for finances were passed without any debate by voice vote amidst order. Surely finances, the budget, is a matter of discussion, is a matter of debate, but no, not allowed to be passed. Government steamrolled it by a voice vote. The fiscal loss to the public exchequer was a gigantic amount of 172 crores. That was in 2010. In the winter session of 2011, Parliament was held up for 9 days by the opposition on various matters like price rise, black money, FDI and retail, and the demand for the creation of a new state of Telangana. Now this is the worst thing which happened in the last monsoon session about 2 months back in 2012. That saw the greatest disgracing of Parliament when the principal opposition party, the BJP, it would not allow the Parliament to function by obstructing its proceedings with demonstrations in the well of the House and shouting. Why? It was demanded that the Prime Minister, Mr. Manmohan Singh, should resign on the basis of a report made by the Controller and Auditor General on certain coal allocations. They claim to be another scam. The BJP stated, and this is the remarkable thing, it claimed the right to hold up Parliament by such demonstrations until the Prime Minister resigned, and asserted that we will do that as a matter of right. The Lok Sabha, this lowest house, lost 77% of its working time, and the Rajya Sabha 72%. Every hour that was wasted meant a loss of rupees 1.50 crores of rupees. Only 4 bills were passed out of 29 pending bills in the session. The Lok Sabha passed 3 of them in 20 minutes amidst din. What legislative activity can you say this is? The presiding officers of both chambers, the Speaker in the Lok Sabha and the Chairman of the Rajya Sabha, were totally helpless. Every day they used to say, please sit down, members could not control, adjourn the House. No disciplinary action can be taken. How much can you punish members after members? So there was nothing to be done. The Prime Minister offered to debate the CAG report and to discuss even his so-called culpability, but this was not permitted by the principal opposition party, the BJP. The normal parliamentary method of such cases, when you refer the matter to a parliamentary committee, was avoided, and therefore that was given up. Now, even more disgraceful was a scene where the government wanted to move a constitutional amendment act to provide for reservations of backward classes and scheduled castes and scheduled tribes in promotion. On September the 5th, the upper house, the Rajya Sabha, as well as thousands of people viewing it on the television, witnessed the unbecoming spectacle of a physical scuffle between 2 members of 2 parties, one who was in favor of the bill and the other was against it. Never has such a scene been seen in Parliament. It is imitated elsewhere in the assemblies like Jammu Kashmir, etc. The House had to be adjourned from day to day. Parliament has come to a stage when even legislation can be prevented from being introduced in Parliament because another political party is against it. The monsoon session of Parliament was the most degrading one in the 60 years of Indian Parliament. Such demonstrations and obstructions are becoming endemic, ruining the highest democratic institution of our country. Now just see this, statistically, somebody has noted it, that in the Lok Sabha, the number of hours which are lost due to disruptions. In the 10th Lok Sabha, 9.95% was lost by that sitting time. In the 11th Lok Sabha, 5.26%. In the 12th Lok Sabha, 10.66%. 13th Lok Sabha, 22.4%. And in the 14th, 38%. And in the last session, must be 100%. Now, today no session of Parliament or State Assembly passes without a major disruption caused by protests of agitating MLAs or MPs. And agitating take a wide range. Outside, in the very premises of Parliament, protests, agitations takes place. Outside in the streets, you have large amount of demonstrations holding up the normal public life of the country. The Supreme Court has said that these sort of demonstrations which hold up the normal public life in cities is against the rule of law. But that's about all. Nothing goes beyond this. Now, is this something which is endemic or something which is within our own constitutional history? You remember that Gandhiji developed the system, or he developed the system of protests by satyagraha. But it was what he called non-violent satyagraha. Now this was realized that after independence we should not have such a system, because it would be completely contrary to our own constitution, our own government, which is ruling by consent. So on the very last day of the concluding session of the Constituent Assembly, Dr. Ambedkar, who was the architect of the Constitution, said this: if we wish to maintain democracy, he said, not merely in form but also in fact, what must we do? The first thing in my judgment we must do is to hold fast to constitutional methods of achieving our social and economic objectives. It means that we must abandon the method of civil disobedience, non-cooperation and satyagraha. Because boldly he said this: where constitutional methods are open, there can be no justification for such unconstitutional methods. These methods are nothing but the grammar of anarchy, and sooner they are abandoned, the better for us. It was a bold statement. It was made when Gandhi was still alive. But independence did not put an end to all this. The media today will not focus on parliament and debates, if any. It's just not interested. Public is not interested. And now the media, and today the television media is one of the most catchy and appealing media. It focuses upon disturbances, demonstrations, and no reporting whatsoever of any debate within Parliament at all. Why? Because for politicians, blockading the legislature is the best publicity they could possibly get. So today we have a complete breakdown of the Westminster form of government. It's a matter for consideration what we should do today. What is the explanation for all this? Many explanations are given. There are some parties like the leftists and the Marxists who have never thought highly of representative government. They feel that this is a capitalist form of government in which people's representatives have no choice. A large portion, a considerable percentage of the MLAs and MPs today have regrettably a criminal record. They are still elected because, in spite of them having some criminal record, and therefore this has impacted upon the respect for Parliament by the downgrading of members of Parliament and legislatures. But more than this, there is a perceived failure in the eyes of the public of government being able to meet the demands and aspirations of the people, compounded by a general perception these days of corruption in the Indian society. With little or no faith in the legislatures and in the electoral system, there is therefore a great temptation for political forces to take to direct action. With loss of faith in government and legislatures, increasingly there is a tendency to resort to courts of law for public grievances. And it's one of the more debatable things that our Indian courts, completely disregarding the separation of powers, are now taking upon themselves the task of enacting rules which are almost indistinguishable for legislation in certain cases, and the otherwise correcting government in day-to-day matters. And the ostensible justification given by the courts, including the Supreme Court, is we are doing This because the other branches of the government are not carrying out their constitutional duties. The public perception today of widespread corruption in India, in government, by favors given by ministers and officials without any legislation to control corruption, has led to public protests by the so-called civil society. We have something what is called civil society in India to distinguish it from the official government mechanism. Early this year, you might have heard about it, a prominent social activist called Anna Hazare and his team, claiming to represent the civil society, demanded the enactment of what is called the Lokpal Act. It's a sort of an ombudsman act in a larger way to control government by a statutory mechanism and to punish the offenders. It had a vast appeal because today, if there is one thing which attracts public attention, is a charge of corruption. Anna Hazare undertook a fast. Now, those fasts are generally borrowed from the Gandhian times, a totally different context altogether. And he undertook a fast in New Delhi for many days, demanding the passage of this particular Lokpal Act, which, mind you, his own team, with many Supreme Court lawyers there, drafted the act and said Parliament must pass this act, taking over the functions of Parliament and demanding the passage of that act. After many days of fasting, in which public concern grew about his health, government at last prevailed upon him through some intermediaries to give up the fast, undertaking to pass that particular bill quickly. And the bill was moved with some suggestions from Anna Hazare's team by the lower house, Lok Sabha, but in the upper house, because of the pandemonium created on the last day of the sessions, it gave away and this bill has not been passed. Now, this is a sort of extra legal basis in which you can today influence Parliament. This Anna Hazare movement is now typical of the movements which we are witnessing. Of late, those who have been in India or those who are familiar with the media, Indian media, will have noticed that some new team has been formed by a gentleman called Mr. Kejriwal, and he has promised to form a political party whose ostensible purpose is only to weed out corruption and clean government. And he calls his team IAC, India Against Corruption. These members have now made sensational disclosures in 2 or 3 cases of wealth accumulated by politicians and their kin. And therefore this creates a great publicity, and whether this can be now considered to be a new type of society movement is to be considered. All this today comes because of another phenomenon in Indian politics, and that is the phenomenon that you cannot have in India a party which has by itself a majority strength in Parliament. Today, parliamentary government has to depend upon coalitions which are formed by small little parties supporting a larger party. And in the absence of those parties supporting Parliament, government cannot function. It's impossible today to ever imagine that there will be the type of stability which was there between 1950 to 1970 with one party having sufficient control of the Lok Sabha. That itself created certain problems. But today's problems are that you have one party depending with largest vote depending upon 3 to 4 smaller parties giving their support. And those parties demand their own way and their own price for supporting. So we have to consider whether in the present fractured state of Indian politics, we will ever have a stable government without the help of minor supporting parties who demand their own shares in their own particular interests. Correspondingly, today Parliament presents the picture of an indecisive body in which citizens do not have faith. The parliamentary system on the verge of breaking down, with civil society taking to demonstrations and to demands outside Parliament, the question is, what do we do in India? We have no doubt still all the forms of democracy, but is this the real content of democracy is to be considered.
I was hoping that Ajay Makkan would still be here for this session, because I was going to thank him for the fact that during the election, the general election in 2009, I must have received maybe several dozen SMSs from him every day when I was in Delhi, saying, vote Ajay Makkan for Ukraine. He didn't send them personally, I don't think. He was probably too busy to press the send key, but I did get them from him. But being only a PIO, I wasn't allowed to vote. You don't have that nice reciprocal arrangement that Indian citizens who live in the UK can still actually, vote. And well, I don't want to divert to Pakistan, but there are actually several constituencies which fill up with postal voters from Pakistan at certain times of the year, and then you get sort of new people being put into power in some northern cities. But that's another matter. So, this whole subject of representation, protest, parliamentary democracy is difficult to analyse in India, because in certain ways it corresponds to what is happening in other parts of the world. You can look at the Occupy movement, you can look at the different protest movements around the world, look at the Arab Spring, and superficially at least it can appear to be similar, but I think probably in more ways it's different than it is similar, as I'll go on to try to explain. And I think that when looking at the problems of creaking, chaotic Indian democracy, it is important to remember that across other parts of Asia, particularly West Asia, the democratic system in India is still seen today as some kind of beacon, just as it was in the 1950s when India voluntarily moved to democracy under the new constitution. That was a purely voluntary act. You sometimes hear people on TV in Britain saying, Britain gave India democracy. Well, Britain did give things to India, but it did not give democracy. That was a purely Indian creation in 1950. And if you look at the voting that took place before 1947, it was normally in restricted ways under a restricted franchise in certain parts of places that were not under princely rule. So I think that being in India during an election today is in many ways much more encouraging than it was in the 1990s, for example. The Election Commission is remarkably efficient, sometimes maybe even too efficient. For example, pulling over an election van because it's got one poster rather than two, or somebody is maybe speaking on a loudspeaker at the wrong time. But I think the fact that that does have its kind of own energy and its own momentum is very important. Particularly, again, if you look back historically to the fact that Churchill, for example, during the debates in the 1940s about India's future, was pretty certain that democracy could not be practiced by Asiatics, to use a phrase of that time. India was seen as too big and too varied to be democratic. So again, whatever the problems are, it comes out of something that is fundamentally positive and is really extraordinary. I mean, the idea that a democracy can operate on this scale, can function on this scale, leave aside the problem with particular politicians or political parties. And it was very striking to me when I was in Egypt. This was about a year or two before the Arab Spring happened. And I remember trying to have a conversation on several occasions with people in Egypt about politics, about how they perceived Egypt's place in the world or in the region. And people were still, at that time, too frightened really to engage in conversation about how they saw the politics of their own country. And spending a lot of time in India, that was extraordinary, because in India, if you're trying to write a book or research anything, everybody has at least a dozen opinions for you. You're never going to have a problem with people saying, I don't want to say, or I'm not sure, or giving some sort of locution that avoids answering the question that you're putting across. And of course, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt did, interestingly, make overtures to the Indian Foreign Office, to the MEA, saying, well, if elections do come about, would India be able to help take part in the monitoring of that process? Obviously, for obvious reasons, they didn't want to turn to the European Union or the United States, and so India for them was the logical place to turn to help with the institutionalizing of democracy. And I think that when the Anna Hazare movement was in full flight last year, that when you heard, particularly on certain TV channels, times now, this phrase, this is India's Arab Spring, my feeling was, well, it's not really India's Arab Spring, because the people who are demonstrating and the way in which they're demonstrating is quite different. It's being done for quite different reasons. And of course, protest has for a long time been so much part of Indian public life that in a way, the version of protest that you see in the case of Anna Hazare or Mr. Kejriwal is not necessarily something that should be seen in a purely beneficial way. In some ways, it's quite a conservative form of protest. In some ways, it's quite an undemocratic form of protest. And I think it was really very often a matter of the vanity of the TV anchors, in that they wanted to say this is India's Arab Spring or India's Spring. They've got a spring, so let's have one here in Delhi and in other cities. So the Indian tradition of protest is, I think, very, very important when looking at this idea of representation. And that is something that goes back a very long way. I mean, interestingly, Macaulay, who you, sir, mentioned earlier, was somebody who upheld the principle of press freedom. Not only did he do this thing of the deorientalization and the instituting the increased use of English, not only did he do the penal code, but he also stood up for the principle of freedom of the press. And the issue of freedom of the press at that time, particularly in Bengal, was about the fact that the British merchant class were saying sort of vicious and reactionary things against the British governing authorities in India. And some people were saying, well, they ought to be closed down, they ought to be quietened down, because we don't want this sort of thing to go out in public. But Macaulay was the one who said, no, this is the nature of government. You have to put up with the fact that people are going to be saying things about you that you don't like. And you see the effects of that almost 100 years later. When I was writing about France's young husband and the British invasion of Tibet of 1903, 1904, some of the best accounts, or some of the most interesting accounts of what was happening, were to be found in something called the Digest of Native Papers. In other words, papers that were being published in different Indian languages, mainly in Bengali, which were then translated into a digest in English, I think once a week or once a month. And it was really only there that you saw Indian commentators saying, this is a really ridiculous and pointless military escapade which is going to bring really no benefit to India. And yet if you read the British press at the time, it was more how exciting, we've got amazing guns, we're going to Tibet, we're going to knock the Dalai Lama off his perch, and so on. So the way in which that sort of imperial war was reported reflects that tradition of protest and of free speech. And there's just one quote from Macaulay I can't resist making in this context, which is that he said, a good government, like a good coat, is one that fits the body for which it has been designed. And I think, in a way, the problem that we're seeing at the moment of this intense protest is largely a problem of design. It's the fact that there are certain things that were set up as a consequence of the Indian Constitution, which is a truly remarkable and fascinating document, but there are certain consequences of the Indian Constitution which now no longer fit the structure, if you like, for which it was designed. And I think that happens in all sorts of ways. I think that in many respects Indian government is too small. People often complain about it being bureaucratic, but in some cases that is because it really doesn't exist in certain places, and where it does exist it sort of monitors too much. The Indian Foreign Service, famously, is about the size of Singapore's Foreign Service. You have Indian diplomats who have to do the same job as maybe a dozen people in the same relevant department in another country. And I think you get that across government in different ways. So it's almost as if there is a structural problem. And the other example, which I think is very important, is the fact that once the decision was made to have a universal franchise in India, it was pretty much inevitable that sooner or later you would have the rise of regional parties, caste-based parties, people representing themselves, people no longer being willing to say, well, Pandit Nehru and the Congress Party will speak for us. Instead it was, we're going to form our own organisation and we're going to represent ourselves. Once that happened, it was inevitable that you would have the kind of fractionalisation that you see now, which leads to the situation where, as you said, you can always in the future be certain there are going to be a series of smaller parties propping up a larger party. There is never going to be a situation, again, in the next 100 years, as far as I can see, where you're going to have any one party being big enough to form the government on its own, which means a whole range of adjustments and compromises need to be made, and there needs to be really a recognition that the regions are going to be even more powerful than they are now, and that is something that is so different from, for example, the politics of the 1960s or the 1950s. I mean, some of the reforms and changes which came in the 1950s and 60s would simply be sort of impossible to do now. You'd never get that kind of cross-party support. You'd never be able to pressurise regional leaders in the way that they could be by a weekly letter, for example, from the Prime Minister 50 years ago. So, I don't want to speak for too long, I've only got another 10 minutes. So I think that if you like, the liberal tradition in Indian politics, which before independence was seen as something that was going to be very powerful and very important, has to a large extent been eclipsed. Instead you have a new kind of populism which can really be identified quite a lot earlier on. If you think of something like the JP movement in the 1970s, that is primarily a populist movement. It's coming out of the assertion that somebody can take hold of a crowd and use that crowd to supposedly represent the people. And I think that probably Anna Hazare, you know, if he looks back, maybe he looks to Gandhi, but I think he also probably looks to the JP movement and the idea that he can claim to represent others. But of course, as Ambedkar famously said, if you have a democratic system in independent India, then it will become the grammar of anarchy. And the risk of what happened now when sort of Anna Hazare was in the ascendant is that you did have that grammar of anarchy. You had an essentially undemocratic attack on democracy, but because of the shaky foundations of democracy and the way it was operating, it seemed to many people very attractive. So I think that if you were to look at the prime causes of that sense of protest that you can often feel in India at the moment, it comes from three things. The first is criminalisation and corruption. Corruption is obvious. I don't think I need to go into or repeat the allegations, many of them true, about corruption of senior figures within the bureaucracy or within politics. Criminalisation, I think, is more complex. When I was writing India a Portrait, my last book, I met some criminal MPs, and I was quite struck by, one, how sincere they were, and two, how popular they were. For example, I went to see Mukta Ansari. He was actually in jail in Kanpur, but I managed to get the stamp on my hand saying Office of the Gatekeeper, and once he got the Office of the Gatekeeper stamp, he was able to go inside the prison. And what was really interesting about him was that although he would be seen as a sort of prime example of a criminalised politician, he was somebody who had a very sort of a very strong social sense, and it was very clear talking to others that he was somebody who also had great popularity. So I think that some of the supposedly criminal MPs are also people who, because of their class background, are quite limited in how they can operate. It's certainly very easy in some of the rougher states of North India to find that you have criminal cases put upon you. Some may be genuine, others may not be. So some of those people who have great sort of charge sheets against them are not always simply criminals. They're often something a little more complicated than that. The second issue that I think provokes protest is the idea of institutionalized failure, that the idea that the institutions that need to be controlling what's happening are not active in the way that they are. If you look at things that have been in the newspapers in the last month about land deals, and there have been the allegations and the counter-allegations, a lot of those issues and problems, and this thing as a reader having to look and say, well, you know, who's telling the truth here over this particular land scam or whatever, comes from the fact that the relevant institution or authority is not making sure that a particular deal is or isn't signed off. If there was a greater faith in the institutions being able to put things into effect that they in theory should do, then I don't think you'd have that sort of popular unrest, if those institutional checks were there. And again, I think particularly in the case of the reporting on Robert Vadra, that was a scandal that was waiting to happen. I don't think anybody within political or media circles would have been particularly surprised about that and the way in which it came out. And it was, in my view, coming out of, more than anything, I'm not talking about that particular case, but I'm talking about the whole range of scams, these sort of scams that all unite in one collective idea of the people in power being corrupt. What it comes out of more than anything is the fact that educated, aspirational, successful middle-class Indians are more than ever excluded from the routes to political power which would have been open to them in the past. There is very little mobility inside the system now, except at state level. And I think that because there is no outlet, inevitably you have people feeling, well, I'm angry about the fact that I want to do something but I can't do anything, so instead I will go for the politics of protest. Certainly within the Congress Party, if you are a young, aspiring, would-be politician, you know that there is almost zero chance of you getting a ticket to become an MP in Parliament. You might become an MLA, there are ways of getting there, but your chances of getting to Parliament in the Lok Sabha are almost nil. And Faisal Devji alluded to the study that I did of nepotism in Indian politics, and just to summarise that for anybody who didn't see it when it came out last year, some of the statistics are the fact that hereditary MPs, in other words, people who have a mother, father, uncle, grandfather, or another close relative in politics, hereditary MPs are on average 4.5 times richer than regular MPs. Hyper-hereditary MPs, by which I mean people who have several different family members in politics, are even richer on average than business people who've gone into politics. So you think, well, in any democracy, in Britain, in the United States, you make a lot of money in business and you think, I want to put something back, I want to engage in public service. But even those very rich business people are poorer than the hyper-hereditary MPs on average. In some parties, as many as 100% of MPs come from political families. If you look at the younger generation of MPs, it tends to be more extreme. 9 out of 10 Congress MPs under the age of 40 are from political families. That is an extraordinary statistic, 9 out of 10. If you plot a graph between MPs under the age of 30 and MPs over the age of 70, there is an absolutely straight line. 100% of older generation MPs do not come from political families. They climb the greasy pole of politics in the same way as everybody else in any other democracy. 100% of MPs under the age of 30 in the Lok Sabha come from political families. There is a straight line based, if you correlate age against hereditary politics or nepotism. And I think it's that sense of exclusion, the fact that the aspirational, educated middle class are pretty much pushed out of the political system, that is at the root of a lot of the anger. So just to finish, I think that inevitably once the routes in are blocked off, the pressure is going to come out in some other way. And I would agree that the failure of institutions also extends to the functioning of Parliament. I think it was a grave misjudgment by the BJP to persistently disrupt the last however many sessions of Parliament, because I think the effect of that is that not only do people get fed up with politics, not only does it promote the drama of anarchy, but it also in fact leads to what in Britain is called sofa government. In other words, the idea that everything is done behind closed doors. In Britain it was coined to describe the way in which we went to war in Iraq. It was Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair and one or two others on a sofa quietly having a chat and deciding government policy. It was not the result of debate around the cabinet table. It was not the result of the debate in Parliament. And I think that does tend to happen in India now, that really, if you look at the way that political decisions are being made, it's a cabal, a tiny cabal of people making decisions, and then very quietly it's put out, such and such is the new move that the government is going to be making. And I think that really, if you look at the long-term effect of that, you increasingly begin to wonder whether a parliamentary democracy, which, as Churchill famously said, 2 cheers for democracy, is there another better system? you increasingly do begin to feel, if you have this growing strength of the regions and of caste-based parties and this fractionalisation of politics, maybe it might be better to move to some form of, for example, executive presidency. Do you simply accept that the power of New Delhi is declining and becoming weaker? Or do you say, well, actually, there ought to be some kind of realignment where somebody at the centre can speak for the country? Because if you don't go down that road, what tends to happen, as is happening now, is that foreign business people and foreign governments that engage with India increasingly want to do it on a state level. They know that a particular chief minister will listen to them, and so they go not to Delhi, but they go to a state capital. And I think that that has kind of happened by default, and maybe it would be better to acknowledge the consequences of that and look at some sort of realignment at the centre. Thank you.
Over 78% turnout, Goa 81%, Uttarakhand over 67%, West Bengal over 84%, Assam over 76%, Kerala 75%, Tamil Nadu nearly 79%, Pondicherry over 85%. So one might query the problem posed in this session about the likely crisis or problems of parliamentary democracy. From these turnout figures, we can, I think conclusively, especially if you're a number cruncher, could say that there is in fact no erosion of legitimacy of parliamentary democracy and the electoral process. And I take parliamentary democracy to mean electoral democracy broadly, and I'm leaving here aside the process of local government. That I'm leaving aside, but I'm taking electoral government. So, undeniably, there is all-pervasive disenchantment with party politics, and there is indeed undeniably bad behaviour in Parliament. There is also extensive political mobilization and action outside of the party political system. But nevertheless, electoral democracy is clearly the winner. So perhaps we need to restate the question to ask, why does India not have a crisis of parliamentary democracy? How is it that you have this scenario, despite all that we have heard so far and we are well aware of? It is also worth bearing in mind in that context, when we are talking about the crisis of parliamentary democracy, those of us who live in this country are aware of bad behaviour within Westminster. They do not shout with placards, I suppose, trained in the decorum of the Oxbridge system, but they do take a lot of money in expenses. And so on. You could multiply, the collusion of politicians with the media of the kind that I think would in fact make some Indians feel quite small, and so on. So one could go on, and now we are increasingly moving into the realm of sexism, etc. So I think when we talk about decorum and behaviour and so on, it's worth putting India in context. So I would like to restate the question to ask, why is there not a problem of parliamentary democracy, and indeed what does that mean? And to answer this empirical puzzle, or indeed a conceptual or analytical problem, let me quote this. Okay, democracy has become the playground for growing corruption, criminalization, repression and intimidation for large masses of the people whose very survival is made to depend on their staying out of the political process, and whose desperate economic state incapacitates them from entering the regular economic process as well. This is the larger context that has given rise to people's movements and grassroots politics and to the phenomenon of non-party political formations. This is not about Indian political scenario today, but about Indian politics 30 to 40 years ago, in the 1970s and 80s. This is a comment by the renowned Indian political scientist Rajni Kothari in a seminal article he wrote in 1984 in EPW, and if you're doing PP, you really must read this. So in this paper, entitled The Non-Party Political Process, much of which reads like an analysis of the present. Here he analyzes how politics in India had expanded and spilt out of the party political system, out of the domain of formal political institutions, and taken the form of agitational action and social movements out on the streets in the face of undemocratic, repressive, corrupt and criminalized politics, as I've just quoted, and in the context of the crisis of developmental policies that had either served to worsen the conditions of some people, either victims of development, or simply not managed to bring about any beneficial change for a vast majority. Importantly, such non-party politics had not, as we now know, gone to undermine Indian parliamentary democracy. Quite the contrary, in fact. In the ensuing decades, this political groundswell served to consolidate India's parliamentary democracy or electoral democracy with, one, a vast and steady increase in electoral participation, as we see here, notably of the poor, the marginalized, the deprived castes and classes, and with the proliferation of political parties, as Patrick mentioned. And this led to a genuine multi-party system. Some of the leading political scientists of India have indeed celebrated the institutional success of India's democracy, as Atul Kohli and others have done in the eponymous book. And Yogendra Yadav has drawn attention to, again I quote, electoral participatory upsurge of the oppressed in Indian politics, while Christoph Jafrelov has written about, I quote, the silent revolution of the entry of lower and intermediate castes in parliamentary and legislative politics, eroding the previous dominance of upper castes and classes. Clearly, a veritable explosion of non-party political processes and social movements in the 70s and 80s did not contribute to the demise of parliamentary democracy or electoral democracy, but helped to buttress and consolidate it. To shed light on this process, Mary Katzenstein and others have argued, following Sidney Tarrow's analysis of advanced democracies, that India is a social movement society that underpins its institutional democratic system. As David Marr, Sid Tarrow et al. Have argued in the 1977 book about Social Movement Society, social movement forms of representing claims are now largely institutionalized, and social movement modes of political action are now part of the conventional repertoire of political participation in the advanced democratic countries of the West. Occupy would be one of those. Social movements and protests outside formal political institutions are not exceptional or sporadic, but routine and recurring features of democratic political behavior, and are pervasively deployed by a range of actors. This, of course, reads like India. They are now a normal feature of democratic party politics as party politics, they are as normal a feature of democratic politics as party politics, and the interaction and the interplay of the two help to buttress the parliamentary democratic system. So, in fact, constitutional government is, one could argue, upheld by the politics of civil disobedience, or indeed the grammar of anarchy. The two are mutually constitutive, not divergent in this case. Not surprisingly, we see today both an escalation of protest modes of politics, as well as the continuing acceleration of electoral participation, which signals the enduring legitimacy of parliamentary democracy in popular perception. There is another way of conceptualizing this relationship of interdependence. The liberal institutionalist model of parliamentary politics is based on the process of deliberation, interest group bargaining, interest group aggregation, party competition, and so on, with the aim of ultimately interest aggregation and the creation of consensus and political stability in a system. Now, this process of consensus building and generating agreement and consent through deliberation, as Chantal Mouffe and others have argued, however, do not allow the articulation of conflict that is ever present in any society or any system, conflict that's based on hierarchical differences of power, inequality, and exploitative economic relations. Social movements serve to provide that space to articulate, and social movements and non-party political processes, as well as agitational modes of politics, provide that space to express precisely these contradictions. In turn, they enhance political awareness and political engagement, and fuel rising democratic political mobilization, including electoral participation, and an aspiration to bring about social and political and economic transformation to the formally constituted state system and the legislative process. It's an aspiration perhaps not always realized, but that is nevertheless their aspiration. This ensures a normative commitment to electoral democracy as a form of expression of people's power and popular sovereignty, and as a vehicle of socio-economic and political change, notwithstanding the disillusionment and anger with politicians and parties. Social movements and agitational politics on the one hand, and electoral democracy on the other, thus have a symbiotic relationship in India. I should like to add here, particularly thinking about the brief we were given, that we do see protest politics all over the world today. But that superficial similarity, as Patrick says, should not mean that we use this model of understanding democracy in other places. The Middle East was very different. The Middle East was not a social movement society where political action of all kinds had been repressed. And as Asif Bhatt has argued, in the Middle East, in fact, there was, before the Spring, action of individuals. He uses somewhat ungainly terms. He talks about social non-movement of non-collective actors. In other words, individuals doing small things, not protesting overtly, but doing small things, but which together brings about a normative and ideological shift in society broadly, which ultimately then comes to erupt in the form of an Arab Spring. I don't want to go too much into this, obviously, because this will be a bit of a digression, but I just wanted to flag this, that the social movement society model is relevant to India, but not all places on earth. Now, so in light of what I have said so far, is there then no case to answer after all? Is what we see today a variant of business as usual, and there is nothing remarkable about the present? What Egalitarian was talking about 30, 40 years ago looks like the present. However, to answer the question, if the question that is there a question to answer, let me look at some recent forms of political protest and non-party politics and analyze their character and significance. And most of these have already been mentioned, but I'm raising them to make certain particular points about them. Now, first, as we know, a few weeks ago, the present government nearly collapsed as one of the coalition partners, the TMC, the Trinamool Congress Party of West Bengal, withdrew support when the Congress-led coalition government unilaterally and without consultation with allies, and by bypassing the parliament altogether, partly because of the antiques in parliament previously, by bypassing the parliament, announced policies to allow foreign direct investment in retail, aviation and broadcasting, to help shore up, this was the government's stated purpose, to help shore up investor confidence, and also the government declared at the same time a cut in fuel subsidy with the aim of tackling the fiscal deficit, again to enhance international confidence in India's economy. The leader of the TMC, and Trinamool, as some of you may know, actually means grassroots. So the leader of the TMC, of the grassroots party, took her protest out onto the streets. This is a party part of the parliamentary coalition, but she took her protest out onto the streets, not just the well of the parliament, but out onto the streets, joined the opposition parties in a general strike, as was mentioned earlier, including in the state where she is in power, where her government is in power, and condemned what she saw as the central Congress government's arrogance of power, as well as a disregard of the interests of the grassroots and a collusion with foreign investors. Instead of protesting within the confines of the legislative process, as she should have done, she adopted a social movement and agitational mode of politics, as she had also previously done. It wasn't just because the parliament wasn't in session. She'd previously done so when the parliament was in session. For example, when she disagreed with the Congress when railway ticket prices were raised, or when she accused the government of undemocratic exercise of power, this kind of arrogance of power, by foisting a precedent of its own choosing, with which the TMC did not agree. As we know, the TMC did not agree with the candidature of the current president. Clearly, we see an entanglement here of parliamentary politics and agitational politics, in which a section of the former, the parliamentary politicians, takes recourse to the latter, to the streets, to assert the legitimacy of the democratic political system. What she is trying to show here is that the democratic political system is in fact legitimate if only those of us who are within it in fact contest the power of those who are undermining that system from within. So that's the significance of this particular type of action. Now a second set of politics, as we've already heard, so-called civil society activism, whereby the complex, diverse and plural space of civil society and the concept of civil society is now reified and projected in a unitary and unidimensional way as a domain of civic and political virtue, glossing over significant ideological differences and power differences and so on. And of course here I refer to Anna Hazare, Arvind Kejriwal, and also Ramdev, Baba Ramdev, not to forget him. And that shows the spectrum of very different political ideologies, yet it is represented as a unified zone of great virtue. And they have all, of course, set themselves up in the name of the Aam Aadmi. That's on those of you who know Hindi will know that the cap says Main hu Aam Aadmi, and that is I am the common man, or a common man. in this case. And so, in the name of the common man, they rail against corruption seen specifically in terms of scams and as collusion between individual politicians and individual bits of corporate business that deprive the exchequer of valuable resources. The CG scam, depriving the exchequer of millions of rupees. So that deprive the exchequer of valuable resources, or that bleed the system of resources through abuse of official power. In common parlance, I suppose this would be graft. They resolutely align themselves against themselves as anti-party, and remember, Gotari again. So they align themselves as anti-party or non-party, and by doing so, they seek primarily to reform the formal democratic institutions or the parliamentary party system per se. They seek to bring about the reform of the party system through a system of social accountability, which is what they're after. The Jan Lokpal Bill is really about social accountability. They do not question the legitimacy of democratic institutions or the electoral parliamentary system per se, but they seek to cleanse and strengthen it. The relation here is by no means antagonistic. The aim is to fortify the institutions and the state, not undermine them. Their preoccupation, however, importantly, is not popular participation or mass political engagement or mass mobilization. That's to be borne in mind. Importantly, that is not what they're trying to do. They are buttressing institutions. But rather they attempt to use their own authority not only as the representatives of the masses, to speak in the name of the masses, as we see here, but as the physical political embodiment of the people, in much the same way that Gandhi tried to do, albeit with much greater moral authority, and not in, obviously in the same way. And what they actually do, as been hinted here, is represent middle-class anger against hyper-democracy, if you like, hyper-politicization, and against a hyper-democratization of the lower orders, who are now part of the established political system. So India's democratization, which has allowed the political upsurge of the oppressed, as Yogendra Yadav called it, has clearly created a sense of hyper-democratization that many classes are against. And this represents that sort of attitude. Thirdly, we have, of course, a range of popular movements broadly against policies that displace and dispossess the poor, mainly from land and agrarian sources of livelihood, in the interest of economic growth to be brought about by new corporate private investment. And of course, here we have anything from the recent Ekta Parishad march led by Raja Gopal, in a sort of Dandi march type of way across the nation, to that's the and then there's you have the Iron Lady of Jharkhand, the Ramani, as she's called, who are all, or in southern India against the nuclear plant, where people are protesting not just about the fallout of nuclear pollution, but also about loss of livelihood. So these are right across the country. They also, of course, frequently encounter repression, often brutal measures of suppression. Yet, importantly, their critique does not extend to any fundamental questioning of the authority or legitimacy of the formally constituted political system and electoral democracy, though they do, of course, condemn particular wings of it, the police and so on, or indeed they criticize government policy, but not the system. Even the Maoists ultimately do not seek to overthrow state power, but rather reformulation of government policy. And not surprisingly, therefore, as we've seen in Bihar and West Bengal, developmental intervention and a degree of political pacification by the respective chief ministers has actually helped to contain the Maoist problem. So, importantly, what this kind of politics is doing, therefore, is not challenging the parliamentary electoral democratic system, but rather launching a critique of the economy. And so that's the point that I ultimately want to raise. That in all of the above, we see the deep entanglement of electoral democracy and non-party political and social movements, confirming the point I made towards the beginning about all this being a part of the democratic political system. They're not antagonistic, they don't undermine each other. In the first two, that is the TMC and the civil society variety, we see a direct link with parliamentary and electoral democracy, an attempt to assert or reinvent its legitimacy through various kinds of accountability and so on, rather than undermine it. What they're trying to do is, in fact, cleanse parliamentary democracy. In the third case, i.e. the land grab type politics, grievances and protests are still sought to be articulated within a democratic framework, and the democratic framework is not challenged, its legitimacy is not challenged. The significance then does not lie in posing a threat to or questioning parliamentary democracy or its representative character. What they reveal are the contradictions and exploitations of contemporary forms of capitalism in India. The problems, as revealed through all of these non-party political processes, is not one of politics, but of political economy. They signify either directly or indirectly, implicitly or explicitly, a crisis of contemporary capitalism in India, not a crisis of representative democracy or electoral politics. In the first case of welfarist populism of the TMC, because that is what it is, there is a critique of paradigm of growth and investment, growth and investment-oriented economic policy at the cost of welfarist interventions. That is how the TMC projects itself. In the second, there is a critique of scams, in other words, a form of critique of crony capitalism and the nexus between capital and politics. In the final case, this critique is of course most explicit. There is a moreover attack on what Atul Kohli has termed India's pro-capital and pro-business model of economic growth as distinct from a pro-market one, leading to dispossession and displacement backed by the use of state repression and of protests. So what we have faced in India today is the danger of misrecognition. What is in fact a crisis of capitalism, a problem of political economy, is being seen as a problem largely, or at least not exclusively, but largely a problem of political representation, democracy, legitimacy and corruption. These latter, corruption, criminalization and so on, that are portrayed as the pathology of our polity are of course extremely important, but they're merely the symptoms. They're not the pathology, they're the symptoms, not the disease itself. Kothari in 1984 pointed out that non-party political processes rose out of a developmental deficit and crisis in a context of the developmental state in its closing years. He's writing in the 80s, the developmental state is by now past its best, if you like. Today we have the problems and contradictions of capitalism related to the current, for want of a better term, neoliberal model of economic growth that is manifesting itself through various forms of social movements and non-party political processes. It is then not business as usual in this sense. It's not business as usual after all. And the present moment does signify a crisis, but not one that we think it is, i.e. not politics. But it can lead to a certain kind of political crisis and it can undermine democracy. But again, perhaps not from the direction that we expect. It will not be from below, but it will be from above. It will be from above in the form in which it is already expressing itself, i.e. repression. And it will be from above precisely if some of these, the grievances and demands of these political movements are not addressed. They will be driven towards increasing radicalization, leading then to a closing in of the state structures and an authoritarian response of the kind that we saw in the 70s, of the kind that Kothari was writing about. Kothari was writing still in the shadow of the emergency of the 70s and talking about the significance of social movements in that context. I'll leave it there.
It strikes me that talking about genealogies of social movements in India, the one that keeps coming back, and I think all three of our speakers have mentioned this, is of course Gandhi. Whether his, as it were, more recent incarnations have anything to do with his former ones is another question. But it strikes me that though of course with JP and indeed with Vinoba, you do have the reference to Gandhi in these large scale, in both those cases, forms of social mobilization that were quite different from the recent variety. And I suspect one of the things that might be happening here is the sense that people in Parliament or the government seem to have lost the ability to voice, despite their own, as it were, occupation of the establishment and anti-establishment view. Ashish Nandi said in one of his essays that the thing about Indira Gandhi, and he's talking about an authoritarian style of government, of course, was that she was able simultaneously to express a purely establishment point of view and stand up for the institutions of Indian democracy, and yet on the other hand, at the same time, claim to represent an anti-establishment viewpoint. You might see a similar sort of thing happening with the Constituent Assembly as well, in a very different way, because that is not obviously an authoritarian experiment. As Uday Mehta has recently told us, the interesting thing about the Constituent Assembly, the debates, is that though of course they were meant to represent the people, put in place, not least in the Ambedkarite vision of things, put in place a set of principles and legislation for India that might, indeed probably would not have been passed had they been put to the vote. Here you have the Constituent Assembly representing the people of India, and yet at the same time seeking in a way that was extraordinary to completely radicalize Indian society. So if you see those two moves actually being relatively common in Indian representative institutions, at one time, that coming together of the opposites seems no longer to be the case. That Gandhi has now been expelled to the outside. Other people must claim him, social movements, NGO sector, civil society, much of which of course has been made possible by liberalization and the decline of the influence of the state, perhaps. The interesting thing about this expulsion, though, I think might be that and its own corresponding influence on what happens in Parliament is the importance of democracy by acclamation in such movements. As Mr. Andarjana was telling us, even within Parliament, it's democracy by acclamation, voice votes, rushing the well, it's who can be heard most, who can be the loudest, rather than debate, discussion, and voting. So this happens both inside Parliament and, of course, outside as well, for obvious reasons. And democracy by acclamation, of course, is a classic sign of authoritarian governance, though you might also argue that as Nandini was just suggesting, that it also has something to do with kind of the revolt of the middle class and its increasingly perhaps anti-political manifestations, and not just the middle class. What I find somewhat sinister in this sort of form of rule or democracy by acclamation is the kind of language that is often used. It's ambiguous, but since Ambedkar has been mentioned, it seems to be so striking how all this, the idea of the dirt that must be cleaned, the purity that must be brought back, the pollution, it's a language familiar to us from caste and from caste politics. And I've been rereading Ambedkar recently, and it's very clear in Ambedkar's work that he's highly suspicious of this kind of language, not least when it was used by his great rival, Mahatma Gandhi. The fact that this language has come back to characterize so much civil society protest, I think is instructive in some way. I don't know how, but I think we might want to consider it. Finally, I think, given the fact that all three of our speakers have made some allusion, at least, to the wider international processes within which these forms of civil society protests appear to fit, how interesting it is that civil society protests, say in the Middle East, since the Arab Spring has been mentioned, while they're capable of unseating governments, seem to be entirely incapable of actually transitioning that form of protest into government or into democratic institutions. They can only ever gather on the streets again to protest one more time. The exception, this is also of course true of the Occupy movement and other forms of action of this sort. The exception seems to be South Asia, where whatever you might think of it, both the attempt by Mr. Kejriwal to form a political party and in neighboring Pakistan, the attempt, copycat attempt in some senses, even though the party there exists from earlier times, by Imran Khan to using almost the same language as Kejriwal does, corruption is the big thing, right, for his party as well. To take protest, and Imran Khan, who was a nobody not so long ago, has become a huge phenomenon, as we know, in Pakistan, precisely by deploying the Indian language of corruption and cleansing and all the rest, equally caste-laden in some senses. But actually make the transition from social movement to institutional politics. How that will end, I don't know, but it strikes me that in this sense at least, South Asia does, and India in particular, does offer us some glimpses of a certain kind of future in which there might be a coming back together of the sort of parliamentary form of democratic governance on the one hand, and a highly critical extra-parliamentary form of social mobilization with all its contradictions